Yeah. And so that's kind of the combination. It's a blood pressure spike, piercing headache.
Mm.
It looks like we're recording. So here we go. Hey, good evening. Tony and I decided we'll give you the option of whether or not that there's been a mutiny and he and I have been left here all alone, or if there's been a coup and we've kicked everybody else out of the group. So you be the judge, but here we are for the last week of our journey through the mystery of Christ by Capon. And we're going to look at those last two chapters. And the other thing that is true about this evening is Tony and I are not singing a duet. Josh is Josh has an appointment, a meeting, and so he is not available to give us last week or last session song for this time. But I have good news for you. Are going to let me pull it up here. We are going to begin our series in Lent next week. We're going to look at the metaphors or motifs in Fleming Rutledge's The Crucifixion, Understanding the Death of Jesus Christ. If you've seen her book, read her book, or worked through it, it is very good. But rather than tackle the entire book over the course of the weeks in Lent, Mondays in Lent, we're going to take a look at the motifs. I'm trying to look here and see. Oh, I've got to get the right text message so I can tell you which two, if you happen to have the book. We're going to do the motif of Passover and Exodus next Monday. So if you happen to have that great book, then you can look ahead. Otherwise, I suggest maybe reading through the Exodus and the story of the Passover and the Exodus account. And then we'll pick up there on next Monday. So, Tony, what about George? What did you think about George?
Um, I thought it was a good chapter, a good ending chapter. It was an appealing person and encounter. I think one of Capon's interlocutors said he seems to be more comfortable with men than women or something like that. Uh, but George, I think, was comfortable with himself, which often makes it easier for other people to be comfortable too.
Yeah, I agree. I did think that was a worthy note that his conversation partners did pick out that he I saw some razzing going on there. Of course, he's writing it, but some razzing going on. But he favored the men in the book over the women. I thought that was kind of humorous. So tell us. So in case someone might not have gone through, tell us a little bit about George. Kind of give us a profile, some things that we could kind of keep in mind as we go through the themes for these two chapters.
Okay. Well, George is in his mid 80s, so he's a little older than you, Todd.
Just a couple of years.
Yeah. And he's although Capon has known him for 10 years, he's now in a care facility of some sort, and he's really not feeling very well. His condition is such that he's no longer able to read. It's painful to sit up, and they're considering some sort of a treatment, experimental treatment, which ultimately they don't do, but they do something else, and it gives him considerable relief. And so he probably is thinking that his time is running out, and one of the things he wanted to do with his time was to write up his experience of receiving the peace. And that's kind of how he refers to it. He doesn't, as I recall, he doesn't call it the peace of Christ or the peace of God. He just calls it the peace. And after having had enough struggles in life such that he tried to commit suicide twice, one day he experienced this peace. And he does understand it through a Christian framework, but he doesn't theologize a great deal about it, but he wants to talk about the experience and he wants to write about it. And so Capon and he are having conversations about what this peace that has relieved his sense of anxiety and sense of restlessness is about. And it happened, I think, can't quite remember, maybe you do, Todd, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And but it stayed with him. Sometimes people have an experience like that, and it's memorable but passing. But in George's case, it seemed to be a transformation from one state to another, and so he's anxious to get something written about the experience. And we learn in the second chapter that when he began to feel better, Capon had made some suggestions about how he might go about that, and he had actually George had retained somebody who was able to take dictation and take his notes, and so the project was underway, maybe his end of life project. But yeah, so is that
yeah, no, that's good. That's good. I like that you picked up and pointed out that in an interesting sort of way, given the themes that we've had up to this point, that it was interesting that Capon chose to stay with peace, even though a couple times he said it goes by other names, my grace, forgiveness, etc. And so I thought that may be timely for all of us. There's a lot of upheaval going on. There are a lot of uncertainty in our day. And so to read a chapter that characterizes the gift as peace, call it providential, however we might want to conceive it, but it seems to be pretty pertinent for us.
Yes. I think people are experiencing anxiety and a sense of being overwhelmed and a sense, as you say, of uncertainty. And peace is hard to come by. I wrote recently that I find that in this time you're there anyhow because it's still your work. I'm not preaching every Sunday, but I find it important to be in church and be reminded of another point of reference in which I can find a kind of alternate story and alternate viewpoint. It's very easy, at least for some of us, perhaps not for everyone, to let the contemporary news and certain figures in the news take up a lot of space in our heart, mind, and soul. While wanting to stay informed, I try to resist letting my heart, mind, and soul be taken over by alien invaders.
Right. And to your point, in the chapter on George, there is a bit of an emphasis on the fact that sometimes we have those moments where we don't feel so peaceful, or we're not sure the peace is there, and then we're reminded that it is. In other words, he didn't allow for space that said, okay, well, I've got to do something to re-engineer peace. I've got to do something to achieve that peace. I've got to do something to set me in the place where that might happen again.
Yeah, no, and I'm thinking of, John's farewell discourse, and Jesus talks about the peace I give you is not the peace of this world. And, that can lead to a lot of discussion. What is it? But I think at least it's not nullified, or it's not nullified by this worldly problems or losses, nor is it authenticated by this worldly fortune or success. It's a peace that is not dependent upon the usual markers of this world. And that may pertain to one of the illustrations that I thought was lovely. Capon talks about this piece is always there, that the band is always playing. But if we've been to a dance and we, for a while, the normal rules are suspended, and we join in the dance, however brilliantly or enthusiastically or haltingly, but then he notes that the music in a normal dance, the music stops and people slip back into the world as it normally is. Husbands and wives arguing, people drinking too much, somebody working a real estate deal. So that was a nice illustration, I thought, of a couple things. One was that the peace of Christ kind of breaks into this world in a way that is not just of this world.
Mm-hmm.
This world. You can have that peace as a gift, even in very trying circumstances. In fact, sometimes it seems to most often appear in such times.
Yes, and I think that was an interesting line when George is kind of describing what happened in that moment 30 years prior. He was saying, just one day it just surprised me. It came over me, and I just knew I had been accepted, he said.
Uh-huh.
And I got to thinking about, how that sort of sense is like new music to dance by,
Uh,
when you've grown up in sort of this sense that I've got to do something to be accepted. I've got to kind of work my way into, say, a social group that I want to be a part of. Or if you grew up in certain church contexts, there are things I need to do to be accepted by God. And to hear or be surprised that, hey, wait a minute, you're already accepted, certainly puts the feet to moving in a whole different way.
yeah. And interesting because if you, he did note 30 years ago, he's now in his mid 80s. So that means he's in his mid 50s when he
Right.
has this experience,
Right.
which means that he's kind of passed beyond that phase when most people are trying to establish themselves. And I certainly did. And you're kind of into I think it's a somewhat dangerous time because on the one hand, you realize by the time you're in your mid 50s, at least I think many of us, that you are what you are. And not only that, but while there will be other chapters, if you're fortunate enough to have a longer life, you're probably not going to be starting ex nihilo at this point. I mean, there's a kind of way in which, on the one hand, all of that can make you more anxious and sometimes leads to my observation as a pastor to affairs and that sort of thing at that age. But on the other hand, it can lead to a kind of coming to grips with life and with yourself and experiencing a certain kind of acceptance.
Mm. That's good. That's good. Yeah. Yeah. I would wonder if what you're describing could apply the same at different stages. It just strikes us at a bit of different impulse. And so, like you described, it would mean that there would be maybe different responses to that feeling than what we would have maybe at a younger point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't mean to nullify the surprise or grace aspect with a naturalistic or life stage explanation. It just thought that was the timing was interesting.
Yes. Yes.
But I do think it's clearly in his description, not something he has worked out, not something he's figured out, not something he's solved, not something he's achieved. It's something that came to him. So it's more it's revelation in that sense. God has revealed God's self. God has revealed a peace.
Yeah.
Comes as a gift, and I think that's one of the distinctives of Christian faith. So many other traditions are either law traditions where you're working to get to a certain place, or in the secular world, there's a lot of emphasis on figuring things out, getting control, getting things down, getting on top of things, but it's all stuff I need to do, and it's sometimes. It's the rat on the wheel because the faster you run, the faster it goes.
Yeah, it's this never-ending pursuit for the best optimization, so that now you can find some time to spin the wheel longer, if not faster. So yeah, that's a good point. Before we go into something Joni mentions in a comment, I liked the emphasis on accepting that we're accepted, because we have there is, and maybe I'm thinking through the lens of my grandchildren, and there are a couple of them entering, adolescence, teenage years, and even a couple of my younger grands who still seem that the world that they're in is trying to press them into a particular mold.
Right.
So that then they can be accepted by a larger group. And they have great parents who have done a fine job, I think, of letting them know they're accepted and they should accept their acceptance. In other words, their parents aren't asking them to be a child they're not. They're not asking them to be as efficient or proficient in things that just may not come natural for them. And so it just kind of struck me that at whatever age we are, and when the moment of peace lapses, when we're not sure that Jesus is always present, we kind of easy lapse into that. I don't know if we would call it a temptation, but the habit of trying to figure out, okay, how can I feel better about myself and it's predicated on how someone else views me or how someone else receives me. And
Yeah.
so when he emphasized that, part of that peace that comes is accepting that we've been accepted, and he pointed to the parable, the wedding parable, where he invited all the rich guests and they rejected that. And so he went out and just dragged every person on the street. He called all the homeless people, gave them clothes to wear. And he envisions that maybe there had been a skepticism that they'd been accepted. And there at the end, there's one who just refused to be accepted or acknowledge that he'd been accepted. And I thought that was pretty potent, because I think it was Tim Keller some years ago made the point that a lot of people change their understanding of the world and their place in it when they decide that there's a particular social group of which they want to be a part. And so they'll abandon a particular conviction in pursuit of a particular social knowledge that endears them to the new group in which they want to be accepted. So he's talking about young adults, not just adolescents. So there's another place at which the pull, the tug to find a group of which to be a part, we still are betrayed because we're still really not accepted for who we are, not by those groups. And to hear the good news of grace and the peace that George describes, that, hey, I need to accept my acceptance. I need to accept the reality that God has accepted me in Christ. And I think that's always a powerful reminder.
Yeah, I guess I'd want to say to trust that acceptance.
Yes.
It's, you don't want to turn that itself into another task. Gosh, I have to accept my acceptance.
Right.
But of course, that was one of the things Tillich said, accept that you're accepted. And Stanley Auerbach, one of Jason's admired mentors, who I've read a good deal of too, responded to that by saying, "Oh, you're not accepted. Don't be silly." Jason would flesh out that argument better than I, but I think Harwas was saying, something is expected. You are to be, you're to be Christ-like. So I don't know, but I think for the average person, or for the ordinary person that we know in our churches and so on, nobody's ordinary, of course, everybody's extraordinary, but the experience of being accepted is rare and precious.
Yes. And I think Keepa does make the point you're making. I do think he suggests that we trust that acceptance. And so I think he does use that vocabulary. And that leads us right to what Joni made a point in the comments. She said, but grace is always there because Jesus is always there. Anytime we stop our noise, the music comes up. So it goes, he draws back to that dancing motif.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah. And I think that is a thing. We do have a spatial sense that we are left with, that Jesus is somewhere else other than with us.
Yeah, he writes at some point, and I thought that was a good section. I think it's on 168. I'll just read a little bit since.
Yeah, do.
I think it's the third paragraph there. I think you made that very clear, George, a lot clearer than it is to most people. When Christians think about Jesus giving them peace or acceptance or forgiveness, or whatever we want to call it, they very often picture it to themselves the wrong way. They imagine Jesus is somewhere else, that he's not with them, but apart from them. Either they think he's a character back in history, or if they believe he's God, they think he's far away in some place called, quote-unquote, heaven. But in either case, they think it's up to them to do something to earn his presence in their lives, and that if they don't do the right, worthy, merit-earning things, he won't be in them at all. So I think, it's very easy, maybe less so in your Southern Baptist tradition than in my UCC tradition, but to keep Jesus in the past. We have teachings, let's kind of go back and confer on those, as opposed to, is there a living Jesus who is speaking and with us right now?
Yeah, and I think in those who have read past that particular paragraph, where he actually describes how the church has been complicit in creating that particular vision, he does get to one of his paradoxes, that he seems always to be looking at. And so here's the mystery of Christ that was hidden, but it's now revealed. And so he kind of seems to be tugging at what Paul does in, I believe it's Ephesians, where this mystery was once hidden, now been revealed.
Mm-hmm.
Christ in you, the hope of glory, always present. And so he makes the great case that Jesus has been hidden everywhere. So it's kind of that paradox. He's everywhere, but he's been hidden. And as Jesus is revealed to us, we make these encouraging discoveries that he has been there all along. Kind of reminds me, I listened to Jason's Sunday sermon. It was his last sermon in the series on Psalm 23. And he did some work with the Hebrew in the last verse. And I had not heard the text handled quite that way, because I'd never heard anyone deal with the word surely. It really is how we learn it. Surely, goodness and mercy. That it really, the verb there is only a goodness. In other words, God is pursuing. So God is the good shepherd leading, closes the chapter with goodness, and God is pursuing us as well. So God's leading and God's pursuing. Kind of reminded me of St. Patrick's breastplate. He's everywhere. So he's leading me to still water, but he's also pursuing me with goodness and mercy. And we make those discoveries through the moments in life where, like George, we're surprised. Oh, there he is.
Mm-hmm.
He's always been there, and I didn't realize, or I didn't recognize. So I thought that was, like you said, a very, very good, rich place in the chapter describing how near and close Jesus is, and the ways that we often make it a meritorious moment. We got to merit his presence as opposed to seeing it.
Was he also saying that the mystery of Christ talks about is something present in all creation?
Mm-hmm.
Is he also saying that, how to put this, that the church doesn't have a kind of a sole franchise on this operation? That the mystery of Christ present in all creation, in all times and places, is not something you may learn about it, you may hear about it, you may experience it at church, but it's not something we're in charge of. Indeed, I just wonder if that's what he was saying.
Yeah.
Well, and so in that sense, someone could experience the mystery of Christ as experience this acceptance or peace without being a part of the church. I don't know. Is that what he's implying?
I'm going to have to beg off and say I really don't know. I think the context, and given his particular background, I don't know he'd be so willing to say apart from. I think he's an even-handed critic to say that sometimes the church is missed. But I don't know that he would say that. Yeah, I don't know. I think Jason might jump in with maybe some Robert Jensen, if not Bart, and probably not say that it could be understood apart from the story lived out in Christian community. I just would find, and that's where I'm not the expert on Capon, so I don't know, but I would figure that his particular his particular branch of the Christian tree would something like what Dennis has here in the comments, that having peace in one's heart is not a private or individualistic experience, but is rather a corporate and ecclesial reality that is shared with others in the community of faith. I think it would be that discovering Jesus at work in the world is made plain to us through the story told by the church.
Mm-hmm.
That I don't know that Capon would say that discovery could be made apart from the story of God narrated in the community. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I was raising the question, kind of the implications of his Christ thesis and what he was saying. We missed Jason, who would clarify these matters for us.
Yes, we'll have Jason. We'll make a note. I think
I'm sorry he didn't make it. I was going to congratulate him for his role in the movie Conclave.
That's good. That's good. I need to see that. He said it was really good. I think one thing about that mystery that I do think Capon was emphasizing was that the universality in the sense that it is present for everyone. Because I think his thematic piece is it's not a result of merit. It's not a result of performance. It's not a particular execution on our part that,
Yeah.
puts us in that place. And so in that middle of 171, I think that's where I was. No, let me see here. In the middle of 169, it's already there for everybody. No one has to run around looking for it. I think his euphemism there is a way of saying that you don't have to find the right ladder to get there. That God at work in his narrative in the world is always present. Our discovery of it, of course, is the work of the Spirit through the life of the church, I believe. He may think other. We might have to take that up with Capon in glory.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
When I caught the next thing I kind of caught was it kind of goes back to he keeps playing on this acceptance, and in 171 he says they're having the discussion about Bonhoeffer's notion of cheap grace, and this is where I think that Jason's got his line. I've heard him say before that grace isn't even cheap; it's free. And so he's talking about the way Capon kind of turns the phrase to say that the idea that we would talk about grace as being cheap actually is a reversion to did you do enough to merit the grace? And are you doing enough to lay claim to grace has captured you? And so I think that's why in that top of 171, and he comes down to that second full paragraph. Look at what you just said. You said you weren't a disciple in Bonhoeffer's League, just someone trying to be a Christian. I don't buy that. I think your acceptance of all your difficulties is discipleship. And since it's always easier not to accept such things, to resent them, and to blame other people or God for them, I suppose that in some sense it's true that you've made the, quote, costly response to grace, and that those who wallow in resentment and blame have made the, quote, cheap response. But the distinction still bothers me because it leads someone like you, someone who really sees that the peace that comes by grace is the only thing that matters, the only thing God finally cares about, to say you're somehow not doing what you obviously are doing. So I think he seems to set it up as though there is the potential, and again, I'm trying to make an appeal back to one of Jason's regular emphases that it seems easy for us to recreate the law out of grace. He calls it the gospel, and that he's helping George understand that to minimize his recognition of the peace and grace of God is not cheap. It's a recognition of the gift in such a way, and there shouldn't be the move to work backward to say, okay, well now I've got to measure up to a certain qualification. This is also the place at which I think they would invoke Fleming, who has talked about Capon, running out of the stadium with the football. We've had that analogy a couple times, and so I think there is balance we need to have for that.
Yeah. Well, and this is nuanced territory, and
yes,
we're kind of talking about it in words and concepts. I think I used to say grace is free, but it's not cheap. I didn't mean you have to earn it, but I did mean that it's not enough just to have a kind of just to talk about it as a concept.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If we've experienced grace, it works a change in us, and that doesn't mean that we're perfect by a long shot. It means in some ways that we're more aware of our imperfections, but there is some manifestation not to merit further grace or But it just, it's like the parable of the unforgiving servant is after having been forgiven much and not forgiving even a little, something has, so it's easy, I think, to repeat lines like we're saved by grace or we're saved by the grace of Jesus Christ. But, getting down to where that really has gotten a hold of our hearts, which is what happened to George.
Yes, yes, yes.
And then Capon is citing that his response to pain, suffering, aging, of not being bitter or blaming others is a manifestation of grace. I think that's true. One does. You don't want to make certain behaviors, attitudes, or whatever a condition for grace. On the other hand, you I think believe that grace is a power that does change lives.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, and that's where that's, I think, one of the things that we've seen from the beginning that we would like to have seen maybe more of. And that evidently wasn't Capon's point, but there could have been, for me, an occasion on 172 that when there's talk about a new creation by the mystery of Christ. And then George says, I don't know. It sounds very much like, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? When Paul thought of that, he said, God forbid. And of course, Capon does pull the Greek out. May it never be so. May that never come to be. May genoitai. That's it could have been here that he could have, emphasized a bit about, hey, George, this transformation has taken place in you. The very conversations we've had over time have clearly indicated that the grace, the peace that's come to you has overtaken that life before, the life where you had despaired, where you maybe were to the point of being despondent.
Yeah.
And so it has worked a change in you, but he didn't.
I think Capon's working very, very hard to avoid any kind of notion that we must earn this. It makes me think of a line that I heard Fred Craddock say one time, great preacher and teacher of preaching. He said, every good sermon is heretical. And by that, this is a part of the truth, but it can't get, so you're kind of leaning in. So Capon is kind of a manifestation of that. He's telling a truth, an important one, but he's not gonna nuance it at all because he wants to keep it as radical as he can, the grace as radical as he can, and so he runs out of the stadium with it. But it's, I think in life we struggle with the right. I don't know what the right word is, but yeah, it's something that is greater than our capacity to express verbally.
Yeah. And I do think the context at where someone encounters, say, the emphasis that Capon has makes a difference.
Yes.
And for instance, I've been kind of the one who's pushed back a little bit of being too hard because in certain fundamentalist settings, you feel a lot like you're sitting in an AA meeting and you're I am an alcoholic. I'm no longer. I've been sober so many years. And in that confession, some days I want to go, I am a fundamentalist. I've not been a fundamentalist for so many years because the tendency that gets wired into the fabric of our understanding of God's work in the world and in our lives and our response to it, sometimes those things still creep back, and you need to hear the what some might call an overemphasis that is given to grace in what Capon does, because it's very easy to slip back into pulling out the yardstick and creating new laws that actually undermine the good news of grace.
Yeah, it's. I would say that's a bigger danger, and Capon obviously would agree than an extravagant response to grace. This is thinking of Mary's pouring out all the perfume on the feet of Jesus is,
Yes.
it's not a measured thing. And it's much easier for many of us, and I'll say myself, to slip back into thinking of God as keeping the books.
Right. Right. Absolutely. We got just a little bit of time. You had your question earlier. I think we ought to come back to about what is there a way to conceive of what Capon is doing when he talks about the mystery of Christ hidden in all of creation, and I don't, you didn't put it this way, but I'm borrowing from page 179, where Frank is pushing back and is concerned that Capon has offered a too generalized view of the peace of God. And so there at the last paragraph on that page, as to whether George's faith was too generalized, I don't think that's an important question to answer at all. We aren't saved by passing theology tests. Here he goes. George is baptized. He receives communion gladly and willingly, and he believes God has given him peace. Sure, I too would like it better if his theological observations were a little bit more tightly focused on Jesus, but the real point is that Jesus is tightly focused on George, and that however George formulates his faith, and he does, all you have to do is listen to him. It's his faith he's formulating, and that's probably just fine with Jesus. Mystery of Christ is operative in us, whether we know it or not, or whether we get a proper intellectual handle on it or not. The power of Jesus' death and resurrection makes a new creation of the whole world. After that, any response we may make to it is distinctly secondary. And if that response is an inconvenience to anybody, at most it's only an inconvenience to ourselves. So he's not clear.
Well, and that's okay. I mean, it's that's why we call it the mystery of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Uh, and so I had something I was going to say there. Yeah, I think, well, there's another move there that he's making. The power of Jesus' death and resurrection makes a new creation of the whole world. After that, any response we may make to it is distinctively secondary. That's a kind of an apocalyptic statement that I think is also a good corrective, because in American Christianity, we tend to individualize this, and we forget there is a new creation in Christ that is in us but beyond us, that is cosmic, that is a new world. And we can get, I think he's implying here, too hung up on scrutinizing ourselves as opposed to praising and enjoying and trusting that there is therefore no condemnation in Christ. There is a new creation in Christ. All who are in Christ are a new creation. That
Yes.
tis not our doing.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think that maybe to say he was not clear is probably a little too reductionist. I think because the same conversation has been had with Frank or been represented in the character of Frank over and again, he's kind of drawing a long thread through some of those earlier conversations to continue to make the point that the emphasis is on Jesus and what God has done in Christ for us. That's the mystery of Christ. And that Frank always does seem to be the one to want to come back and feel like that's not enough. So maybe that's a little longer reach than just this particular chapter, because Frank's character has been with us from the beginning.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And the emphasis on something more cosmic and apocalyptic, it does jerk us off fixating on ourselves.
Yes. Yes.
And I think it's also, we use that language sometimes without trying to say a little bit more about what it means. And I think it means the old creation is the one where we're trying to do things to get on God's good side.
Right.
Over now. That's
right.
over.
Right.
And we're living in the world of the dance of grace.
Yes.
And our acceptance. Yes. And it's we slip back and forth between the two, but there isn't enough emphasis, I don't think, in my preaching and in the church on the kind of the transformation of worlds, that there is a creation, and that I guess we're slipping into how can we manufacture that again, or because in a way our problem is it's one thing to say the Messiah is coming, it's another thing to say the Messiah has come. The Messiah has come, then what evidence you could look at the church and not be particularly confirmed in that instinct. We don't seem to be overwhelmed with joy a lot.
Right. Yeah. I think that what you described is a second stream to what Dennis pointed to earlier. The corrective to this individualist private notion that when we do open up and talk about cosmic and these sort of apocalyptic way to talk about the transformation of the world, it is something that opens us up to something beyond ourselves. And so I do think that's right. And then I think your observation, can't find anybody, I can't think of if anybody would disagree, that there are not a lot of days that the church provides good evidence. Got a young Irish philosopher poet friend who wrote a parable in a book. He kind of used that imagery that there's really not enough evidence to convict that a crime happened here, even if we want to say a crime happened here. So I mean, I think he was trying to make the same kind of point, and I would say that maybe one of the reasons for such a lack is an overemphasis on what God has done to the private and individuals. I mean, that seemed to be the criticism that Leslie Newbigin made after his 50 years in India as a missionary. Came back and he found that Christianity in the West was wanting so much because it was too private, which he distinguished from personal, and too individualistic over against communal. So I think maybe there is something to that, that any sort of rupture in the message that can impact and shake us out of a purely privatized religious offering and a purely individualistic expression is a good thing.
Yeah, and we get that, and I think it's also a question of imagination, and it relates to the role of art, because these are imaginative. These are attempts to set our imagination free. Dream kind of in the Joel Axe sense of our women had visions and our old men dreamed dreams. Something big, as opposed to just my eternal destiny is a sure thing, or something like that. And it's hard to imagine. You don't really have a dance with just one person.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Yeah, our relationship's not that much fun.
No, right.
I mean,
right. That's good. That's good.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's kind of, and we are again beat up on ourselves, but the individualization, but it's also, I think, the rationalization that we want everything to add up rationally, as opposed to, it's something bigger. I remember being in Nicaragua once, and there was this beautiful mural of people like Oscar Romero and some of the people who'd been leaders there, and they were all dead. They were in glory. It was just and the worshiping community where the mural was lived in the confidence of that we are even in glory even now, that the new creation is in our midst. And I think that gets back to maybe the point you introduced at the beginning is, the times we're living in. It's easy to be engulfed by that. We don't want to be tuned out irresponsibly or just kind of lost in a Corinthian, we have already arrived thing. But at the same time, experiencing and proclaiming and giving voice to the joy of the Christ is Lord.
Yes.
I think in a time like this is important.
Very important. Very important. Well, Tony, we did it. Whether it was a coup or we were abandoned,
or mutiny.
We did it, and we sure appreciate everyone kind of hanging with us. And so, we could establish, Tony, is because of our age, this was Wisdom Week.
Yeah.
So
That's we're looking
Jason,
will get
to edit, so we'll see how that works.
That's too bad. I think the unedited. We ought to insist on that at our age.
We should.
No more editing. Yeah. Okay, great to be with you, Tom.
Great.
Okay.
All right, folks. We will pick up next week, and we'll pick up with the great work by Fleming Rutledge on the death of Christ. And remember, we're going to look at that motif of Passover and Exodus for the meaning of Jesus' death, or understanding Jesus' death. So until then, hope you have a great rest of the week.
Okie dokie. Thank you. Guess I need to leave mine on to make sure it's uploaded.
Let me see what he said here. I think he gave me some instructions that we could just see what he said to do here. Okay, we're good. So once yours uploads, we can be done. Mine says, I think it's up on top. It'll say how much is uploaded.
Mine says 99%.
Then you should be good. We're good. All right, Tony. Thank you, man. All right.